It was supposed to be a proud moment, a young girl, a hard-earned scholarship and her first step into adulthood. But when 14-year-old Autumn Williams walked into Sterling First Bank with a $5,000 check, what she found wasn't respect. It was suspicion, humiliation, and something far more insidious. On a crisp Monday morning, Autumn Williams, dressed neatly in her school uniform, stepped into Sterling First Bank with a heart full of excitement. At just 14 years old, she had earned a $5,000 academic scholarship through her tireless dedication, and now stood ready to make her very first deposit. To her, this wasn't just about money. It was about independence. But the moment she approached the counter, things took an unsettling turn. Behind the desk stood Tom Myers, the young teller, and watching from a few feet away was Margaret Hawthorne, the bank's immaculately dressed manager, known more for her sharp judgments than her customer service. When Autumn presented her scholarship check, Margaret's pleasant fade slipped. A $5,000 check. "At your age," she said loud enough for others to hear. Autumn, composed but nervous, handed over her school ID and award letter. But the scrutiny only intensified. Tom held the check up to the light, eyeing it like it had come from a con artist. Margaret, without so much as a glance at the girl, declared they'd need to verify everything. When Autumn asked shakily to call her mother, she was coldly denied. As the minutes passed and whispers began to fill the marble-floored lobby, Autumn realized this wasn't just about a check. This was about her. And for the first time she felt what so many before her had felt, judged not by her actions, but by the color of her skin. Autumn stood frozen in the corner of the lobby, her hands clenched tightly around the strap of her school bag. The marble beneath her feet felt colder by the second, as if the building itself had turned its back on her. Around her, the polished world of Sterling First Bank buzzed with normalcy bankers walking briskly between desks, the distant hum of printers, the soft chime of the overhead speaker. But none of it reached her. All she could hear was the echo of Margaret Hawthorne's dismissive words. She had walked in proud and eager, the check a symbol of her hard work, her future. Now she was being treated like a threat. Her phone, the one lifeline to her mother, Danielle Williams, was locked in her school locker, a simple oversight that now left her helpless. And the worst part, no one offered help. Not the teller who avoided her gaze, not the older woman in the corner who glanced her way, then looked away as if embarrassed for her. Not the suited customers whispering behind manicured hands. It wasn't just the waiting, it was the way she was made to wait, as if she were some inconvenience to be managed. Margaret moved across the room like a queen, surveying her court, whispering to Tom, her eyes darting toward Autumn every few seconds. Their hushed tones carried a weight heavier than volume. "We can't let anyone just walk in off the street," Margaret hissed, especially not with a check like that. It wasn't a comment about fraud. It was about identity. Autumn had heard enough, but still she said nothing. Her mother had always taught her to stand tall, stay calm, to let her actions speak louder than any accusation. But this was something different. This was the first time Autumn realized that sometimes your actions don't matter. Sometimes people judge you before you even open your mouth. She looked up at the grand ceiling, the soft golden light casting a sheen over the mahogany trim, and wondered how many others had stood here like this, silent, humiliated, invisible. She had always known the world could be unfair. She had read about it in books, heard it in the news, but those stories had always felt like they belonged to someone else. Today, it belonged to her. Minutes turned to nearly an hour. A silver-haired couple walked in and were greeted with warmth and smiles by the same manager who had all but ignored Autumn. They were ushered into a private office, offered coffee, treated like royalty. A young immigrant man with thick-rimmed glasses tried to speak with a different teller, only to be brushed aside by Margaret with a chilly, "The system's running slow today, sir." But not 5 minutes later, a white couple with identical paperwork was whisked through with cheerful efficiency. Autumn noticed every detail: the tone shifts, the body language, the way Margaret's smile could turn polite or poisonous, depending on who stood in front of her. Her heart pounded with something she hadn't expected danger. Not just for herself, but for all the others she had just begun to see through new eyes. She hadn't walked into this bank to become a witness, but now she couldn't stop seeing the patterns. She reached into her school bag and pulled out the leather-bound notebook she always carried, a habit her mother had encouraged. "Write down what you see," her mom always said. "The world won't always believe your voice, but they can't erase your words." With trembling fingers, Autumn began jotting notes, timestamps, names, what she heard Margaret say, who was treated kindly, who was turned away. Her pen moved fast, fueled by adrenaline and clarity. This wasn't just about a bank check anymore. This was about how people were made to feel. And as she looked around, watching the way heads turned away when she caught their gaze, she realized something else. This wasn't just some rogue manager. This was a system, and Margaret was just the one bold enough not to hide it. Autumn straightened her back. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. She might have walked in as a teenager with a check, but now she stood as a girl who saw the truth. And what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the woman they were all silently hoping wouldn't show up was already on her way. And when Danielle Williams stepped through those glass doors, the game would change for everyone. The quiet fury building inside Autumn threatened to spill over, but she held it back, focusing instead on what she could observe and record. As she stood there in the corner, her fingers gripped her pen like it was armor. The notebook became her shield, her truth. Every detail mattered now: the exact phrasing Margaret had used, the order in which customers were helped, even the tone of voice that shifted with skin color and accent. But just as she was about to jot down another line, something caught her eye a moment, so small it could have gone unnoticed, but not to someone who had spent nearly an hour watching the entire bank like a hawk. Across the room, Margaret had slipped away from her usual post and was now speaking in hushed tones with a man Autumn had never seen before. He was tall, imposing, dressed in a tailored gray suit, with sleek black shoes that didn't scuff the floor when he walked. His presence was confident, too confident. He didn't act like a customer. He acted like someone who owned the place or wanted to. Autumn narrowed her eyes as she watched Margaret hand him a manila folder marked "Confidential." The word was printed in bold, and the way Margaret clutched it to her chest before passing it over made it clear this wasn't standard banking paperwork. The man flipped through the folder, quickly nodding with a smirk that made Autumn's stomach turn. This was no routine transaction. There was something secretive, even conspiratorial about the exchange, and it wasn't lost on Autumn that it was happening while she was deliberately being kept in the background. She strained to listen, but they were too far away. Still, the body language spoke volumes. Margaret leaned in closer, her lips tight, eyes scanning the room as if to make sure no one was watching, except Autumn was watching. And she had already begun scribbling everything into her notebook: the time, the description of the man, the label on the folder, Margaret's shifting behavior. This wasn't just about her check anymore. Something much bigger was happening here. That suspicion hit Autumn like a cold wind. Was Margaret doing something shady? Was this man from a rival bank, or worse, someone trying to hurt the company from the inside? Her mother, Danielle, had often spoken over dinner about how easily secrets could destroy corporations, especially in the finance world. Autumn hadn't paid much attention then, but now it all came rushing back. The look of satisfaction on the man's face as he snapped the folder shut felt less like a business deal and more like a trap successfully laid. Autumn's breath caught when she realized something else. This wasn't just a betrayal of trust toward the bank's customers. If she was right, it was a betrayal of her mother's company. That's when the name hit her like a bolt of lightning. Harrison Wells. She had heard that name before. Her mother had mentioned it just a week ago when talking about business rivals. He was the CEO of Meridian Banking Group, a direct competitor to the financial firm her mother had recently acquired. Autumn's pulse quickened. Was Margaret feeding confidential information to Harrison Wells? If so, this wasn't just an act of discrimination, it was corporate espionage. And Autumn, the invisible teenager standing in the corner of the lobby, had witnessed the whole thing unfold in real time. Her hands trembled as she added another line to her notes, her handwriting growing slanted with urgency. The pieces were falling into place. Margaret's cruelty hadn't just come from prejudice, it had come from panic. Maybe Margaret recognized Autumn's last name and feared what it meant. Maybe her coldness was part of a deeper plan to push Autumn away, to silence her before she could connect the dots. But Autumn wasn't the type to stay silent. Not anymore. A new fire lit in her chest. Not just anger now, but purpose. She might have started this morning trying to prove her independence, but now she had a mission that mattered far more. Autumn clutched her notebook close and whispered to herself the very words her mother had once spoken while working late at the kitchen table. The truth always leaves a trail. You just have to be the one brave enough to follow it. And that's exactly what Autumn planned to do. Autumn's eyes darted between the man in the suit, Harrison Wells, and the still smirking Margaret Hawthorne, 1,000 questions flooding her mind. Her notebook was nearly filled with notes now scribbled hastily, but with the precision of someone who knew this moment could mean everything. Then, without warning, the rhythm of the bank shifted. The air in the room seemed to tighten, and even the constant buzz of background conversation softened. The glass doors at the front of Sterling First Bank slid open with a sharp whoosh, and in stepped Danielle Williams. Her entrance wasn't loud or dramatic, but it may as well have been a thunderclap. Clad in a charcoal gray pantsuit that hugged her tall frame with quiet authority, Danielle moved with a poise that turned heads without trying. Her heels clicked across the marble floor with calm determination, and every step seemed to absorb the attention of the room like a magnet drawing metal. Her dark brown eyes scanned the lobby once was all it took. She saw her daughter standing stiff in the corner, notebook clutched like a lifeline, her body tensed with hours of anxious waiting. That one glance told her everything. Margaret, still standing behind the counter, paled. The smugness she wore so comfortably drained from her face as she realized who had just walked in. Not just a mother. Not just another customer. This was Danielle Williams, CEO of Eastbridge Financial, a name powerful enough to silence entire boardrooms. And more than that, she was a woman with a reputation for integrity, precision, and zero tolerance for unethical behavior. The very sight of her sent ripples through the bank. Margaret instinctively stood a little straighter, forcing a smile that couldn't disguise the panic behind her eyes. Danielle didn't return the smile. She moved directly to her daughter and laid a steady hand on her shoulder. "Autumn," she said softly, "are you okay?" Her voice was warm, but tightly controlled like a dam holding back a flood. Autumn nodded, though her chin quivered slightly. "I'm fine, Mom," she said, managing to sound steadier than she felt. "But there's something you need to hear." Without another word, Autumn opened her notebook and began reading from it aloud. Her voice echoed across the lobby, clear and unwavering. She recounted how Margaret had refused to let her call home, how customers of color had been treated with cold indifference, while white clients received swift, courteous service. She detailed the suspicious exchange between Margaret and Harrison Wells, including the confidential folder and the hushed tones. Danielle's jaw tightened with every word, her eyes locked on Margaret like a laser. By the time Autumn finished, the entire bank had gone silent. Danielle turned toward Margaret, who looked as though she were trying to melt into the floor. "Miss Hawthorne," Danielle said, her voice cool and crisp. "Do you have an explanation for what my daughter just described?" Margaret opened her mouth, but nothing came out, only the slight click of her jaw. "Because if not," Danielle continued, "then what I see is not just the public humiliation of a 14-year-old girl, but also the unlawful distribution of confidential business documents to one of my competitors." She turned toward the rest of the room, her voice rising just slightly. Not to yell, but to ensure every last employee, customer, and security guard heard her. What happened here today wasn't just offensive. It was unethical, discriminatory, and possibly criminal. The silence was deafening. Finally, Margaret found her voice, though it came out choked and defensive. "Two don't know what she thinks she saw. That girl, she was acting suspicious," and Danielle raised a hand, and Margaret's words died in her throat. "I believe the word you're looking for is intelligent," Danielle said. "My daughter didn't just witness your bias, she documented it. And thanks to her, I now have everything I need to escalate this issue to your board of directors, your corporate legal team, and the media, if necessary." Then, with the same grace she had entered with Danielle, turned to her daughter. "Let's go." But as they walked toward the exit, Danielle paused and looked over her shoulder one last time. "Oh, and Miss Hawthorne, expect to hear from my lawyers and from HR." With that, mother and daughter exited the bank. But the storm they had brought with them was just beginning to roll through Sterling First, and it wasn't going to leave anything untouched. The moment Danielle and Autumn stepped out of Sterling First Bank, the heavy silence they left behind shattered into chaos. Margaret Hawthorne stood frozen, her usually sharp posture slackened by disbelief and dread. Around her, the staff exchanged uneasy glances, as if realizing they had just witnessed something irreversible. But Margaret wasn't just worried about losing face. She knew deep down that this wasn't going away with a carefully worded apology or a hastily filed report. She had crossed a line, and the person she had dismissed as just a girl had turned out to be the daughter of the very woman who could dismantle her entire career. The lobby, once a place of routine transactions and polished etiquette, now buzzed with tension. Customers whispered among themselves. A few had filmed the confrontation, and one bold woman was already typing something furious into her phone, no doubt crafting the first of many social media posts that would ignite the internet in hours. Danielle wasn't one to let matters simmer. By the time she and Autumn arrived home, she was already on a conference call with her firm's legal team. Her voice was firm, but it carried a tone her senior counsel hadn't heard in years, a tone that meant this was personal. "Pull every surveillance angle from that bank's security system. I want timestamps matched with Autumn's notes. And I want a full background check on any relationship between Margaret Hawthorne and Harrison Wells." The team responded swiftly. After all, Danielle had built her firm from the ground up with an iron spine and a flawless track record. She was known not only for her financial brilliance, but for her unwavering moral compass. If she smelled corruption, she pursued it with precision, and this time it was her daughter's name on the line. Within 48 hours, the fallout began. An anonymous whistleblower inside Sterling First leaked internal emails messages that suggested Margaret had been feeding client strategy documents to outside sources for months. Worse, Harrison Wells' name appeared in multiple correspondences. It wasn't just discrimination anymore. It was corporate betrayal. The media pounced. Headlines like bank manager accused of espionage and racism dominated financial news feeds. Networks scrambled to get interviews with Danielle, but she declined them all. She didn't need a microphone to be heard. Her lawyers filed a formal complaint against Sterling First Bank, citing both racial discrimination and breach of fiduciary duty. And then, with one press release from Eastbridge Financial, she announced a full audit of the competitor bank Meridian Group and named Harrison Wells in a federal inquiry. Margaret was swiftly placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But that wasn't enough for the public. The footage of Autumn's quiet endurance in the bank, followed by Danielle's composed confrontation, had gone viral. Millions watched. Parents of young black girls reposted it with captions like, "This is why we teach our daughters to speak up, and she didn't raise her voice, but she raised the bar." Autumn, once the invisible girl in the corner, had become a symbol. But to her, it was never about being seen. It was about being respected. And behind the scenes, Sterling First's board was scrambling. Their brand, once a symbol of prestige, was now associated with racism scandal and betrayal. Emergency meetings were called. Executives demanded accountability. In a closed-door session, they voted unanimously to terminate Margaret Hawthorne and formally apologize to the Williams family. But the damage had been done. Back at home, Autumn watched the news unfold with a quiet expression. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she sat with her mother on the back porch, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. "You were incredible," Danielle said softly, placing a hand over Autumn's. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for what's right." Autumn looked down at her notebook, now resting closed on her lap. "I just wrote what I saw she said. I didn't want to be a part of this story. But maybe I was supposed to be." Danielle nodded. "Sometimes we don't choose the moments that define us, but we do choose how we show up in them." And Autumn had shown up unshaken, unafraid, and unyielding. The reckoning had begun, and it started with the courage of a girl who simply wanted to deposit her future. What began as a painful act of discrimination inside the cold walls of a bank had now spiraled into something far greater. Autumn Williams' story wasn't just about a girl and a check anymore. It had become a catalyst. Across the country, conversations ignited in boardrooms, classrooms, newsrooms, and dinner tables. Activists shared the footage of her calm strength, pointing to her as an emblem of dignity in the face of cruelty. Financial institutions quietly reviewed their internal policies, and several CEOs reached out to Danielle Williams privately, thanking her for taking a stand they themselves had been too cautious to make. The impact of the moment extended far beyond the confines of Sterling First Bank. This was a cultural shift, one sparked by a teenager who had never raised her voice but had still made herself heard. At Eastbridge Financial, Danielle's team moved swiftly, initiating a full-scale investigation into the web of unethical behavior stretching between Sterling First and Meridian Banking Group. Evidence piled up quickly. Harrison Wells, once hailed as a visionary in the industry, was now facing a federal audit and a possible class action lawsuit for corporate theft and unethical banking practices. The confidential folder Autumn had seen, handed off, her sharp eyes and precise notes about it proved crucial in uncovering the chain of leaks that threatened the financial security of thousands of clients. That information, coupled with security footage and whistleblower emails, painted a damning picture. Harrison denied the allegations, but his silence during media inquiries and the sudden resignation of two of his executives told the public all they needed to know. But the most remarkable transformation wasn't what happened in boardrooms, it was what happened in Autumn herself. The once shy, observant girl, who quietly blended into her school's honor roll rosters, found herself standing on a stage at Westridge Academy just 3 weeks after the incident, invited to speak to her fellow students about what had happened. She had been reluctant at first. Spotlights weren't something she ever craved. But her mother reminded her, "You don't have to be loud to lead. You just have to be honest." So she took a deep breath and stepped up to the podium. Her speech wasn't polished or rehearsed like the political sound bites she'd seen on the news. It was raw, personal, human. She spoke about the fear of being doubted even when you've done everything right, about the sting of being ignored, not because of what you lacked, but because of what others assumed. And then she talked about her notebook, how she'd written down what she saw, not knowing anyone would ever read it. "I didn't speak out to be a hero," she told them, her voice steady. "I spoke out because silence felt heavier than the truth." The auditorium fell still. Then came the applause, long, loud, and heartfelt. Teachers rose to their feet. Parents in the audience wiped tears from their eyes. Something had shifted in that room, just like it had at the bank. Autumn's story wasn't just resonating, it was rippling. From that moment on, Autumn was invited to panels, youth forums, and mentorship events. Not because she had demanded attention, but because her story reminded others what courage looks like when wrapped in composure instead of outrage. Danielle continued her work behind the scenes, pushing for lasting institutional reforms across financial sectors, while always protecting Autumn from the unnecessary glare of media frenzy. "Let the work speak louder than the headlines," she said. And it did. Sterling First launched a new diversity and ethics initiative, including implicit bias training and customer experience audits. Autumn's voice, once dismissed in a marble-clad lobby, now echoed through halls where real change was being written. But back at home, nothing changed who she was. She still did her homework at the kitchen table. She still helped her neighbors carry groceries. She still smiled quietly when someone said, "Thank you for speaking up." Because that's all she ever wanted. Not to be remembered as the girl who exposed a scandal, but as the girl who told the truth and helped others believe they could do the same. In the months that followed, Autumn Williams returned to a quieter rhythm school study piano lessons. But the world around her had changed. People still recognized her at the grocery store, strangers approached with words of gratitude, and young girls whispered her name with awe. But Autumn remained grounded, never chasing the spotlight. Her story had made headlines, but what truly endured was the message behind it, that strength isn't always loud, and justice doesn't always arrive in a roar. It can begin with a pen, a notebook, and the courage to stand still when the world wants you to disappear. Danielle often told her, "What you did changed more than that banquet changed how people see themselves." And that was the real victory. Autumn hadn't set out to be a symbol, but by refusing to be erased, she became a beacon for others who had long been ignored. Never underestimate the power of quiet conviction. In a world that often rewards noise, it's your principle, not your volume, that define your impact. When you choose to speak up even in silence, you give others permission to do the same. If Autumn's story moved you, or reminded you of a moment you found your own voice, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful true stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us that every voice, no matter how young or quiet, matters.